Hello, BookTube, and welcome to a series of videos in which I am reading you Pride and Prejudice. But I'm no audiobook service. I'm annotating it as I go, as one of you described it. I am interjecting often, not only with did you notice or pay attention tos, which are an old pedagogical habit that you don't seem to mind, but also with just bursts of enthusiasm because it's so much fun to read this thing. It is just so great a book. So we are in part 3 of the book. We're up to chapter 44. Elizabeth Bennet, our dauntless heroine, is out in the countryside. She is, in fact, at Pemberley, the country estate of Mr. Darcy. Now, she and Darcy had a horrible break. Darcy proposed in marriage. He proposed his hand in marriage to her, even though her family is so far below him. And he made sure to tell her in chapter and verse how unworthy they were. That infuriated her. But she'd already been infuriated with him for a couple of reasons. One, his treatment of Mr. Wickham. How horribly he blighted Mr. Wickham's financial future. And two, his treatment of Elizabeth's own sister Jane by manipulating his friend Mr. Bingley, who she loves, to leave her. And she throws all that back in Darcy's face when he proposes, in great detail, that shocks him. And he agonizes all night, and then he writes a long letter the next morning, explaining himself. And he hands the letter to Elizabeth and said, do me the favor of reading that. That's it. He doesn't stick around. He hands her the letter. He waits all morning until he sees her out on her walk, hands her the letter, and says, do me the favor of reading that, and she does. And she's prepared at first when she reads that letter to hate it and to discount everything in it as a lie. She has a fixed opinion of Darcy, and that's all there is to it. But the letter convinces her. The letter changes her. Till this moment, I never knew myself. She realizes that Darcy's criticisms of her family are just. And she realizes that the truth of his treatment of Mr. Wickham is the exact opposite of what Wickham himself has told her. Wickham is the bad guy. He's the villain. She's stunned. And it discombobulates her, so obviously Darcy leaves the neighborhood immediately after giving her the letter, so nothing more comes of it than that. Now keep in mind what each of these young people must think. He handed her that letter. He knows that she has not attempted to verify it. He's given her permission to go to Colonel Fitzwilliam. I say that he's also given her implicit permission to ask anyone else. Ask the old housekeeper at Pemberley. Ask anyone who would know, other than Wickham. But he specifically mentions Colonel Fitzwilliam, and Darcy must know that Elizabeth is not checking his account. He's not asking anyone. She's not asking anyone whether he's telling the truth. So distantly, off in London or wherever he is, he must be thinking that maybe she's just sitting with the letter. But keep in mind where they both are. She is assuming from the fact that she wrongly accused him of horrible deeds that his letter was written in anger to defend himself, and that out there in the world somewhere, Mr. Darcy cannot stand her. And he's out there in the world assuming that since she has never reapproached him, never written to him, never written to anyone about him, saying, could you please pass on a message to Mr. Darcy, to anyone that she knows in common, and she now knows a lot of people in common with him, he's out there in the world assuming that she was either not convinced or didn't care. They think that they have only burned bridges between each other. And then Darcy sees her on the grounds of Pemberley on his own home. And all he can think about, we're not told any of this by Jane Austen, I'm reading this in, but this is my reading. He sees her and all he can think about is how much he loves this young woman. So he's extremely nice to her. He's extremely inquisitive about her. How are you doing? How's the family? He's extremely nice to the Gardiners, even though they were the kind of low relations that he was criticizing in his letter. Extremely civil to them. They are taken with him. All they've heard is nightmare stories about this Mr. Darcy person. They meet him in person, and he's the soul of civility. He's wonderful. But it's more than that. It's more than that. Because Elizabeth can't hide from Darcy that she feels the same way. That jolt, that upspringing of electricity, these two are made for each other. The reader knows that long before they do, but they are starting to realize it. And that is thrilling to see. Just thrilling to see. In other words, in the chapter that we just read, Darcy and Elizabeth realize more or less at the same time that there are not, in fact, any burnt bridges. Which is pretty thrilling. for this old transplanted rhesus monkey heart? That is pretty thrilling. So when are we going to go on and move on to chapter 44? I'm not just going to keep talking to you about this. I'll read it to you instead. This is chapter 44. Elizabeth had settled it that Mr. Darcy would bring his sister to visit her the very day after her reaching Pemberley, and was consequently resolved not to be out of sight of the inn the whole of that morning. But her conclusion was false, for on the very morning after their own arrival at Lambton, these visitors came. Darcy wants her to meet his sister. They had been walking about the place with some of their new friends, and were just returned to the inn to dress themselves for dining with the same family, when the sound of a carriage drew them to a window, and they saw a gentleman and a lady in a curricle driving up the street. Elizabeth, immediately recognizing the livery, guessed what it meant, and imparted no small degree of surprise to her relations, by acquainting them with the honor which she expected. Mr. Darcy, the local grandee, is coming to call. He's bringing his sister. Her uncle and aunt were all amazement, and the embarrassment of her manner as she spoke, joined to the circumstance itself, and many of the circumstances of the preceding day, opened to them a new idea on the business. Nothing had ever suggested it before, but they now felt that there was no other way of accounting for such affections from such a quarter than by supposing a partiality for their niece. While these newly born notions were passing in their heads, the perturbation of Elizabeth's feelings was every moment increasing. She was quite aware of her own discomposure, but amongst other causes of disquiet, she dreaded lest the partiality of the brother should have said too much in her favor, and more than commonly anxious to please, she naturally suspected that every power of pleasing would fail her. She's worried that Darcy has oversung her praises to his sister. She doesn't have to worry, because the sister is just as mousy as Catherine de Bourgh. She retreated from the window, fearful of being seen, and as she walked up and down the room, endeavored to compose herself, saw such looks of inquiring surprise in her uncle and aunt as made everything worse. Miss Darcy and her brother appeared, and this formidable introduction took place. With astonishment did Elizabeth see that her new acquaintance was at least as much embarrassed as herself. Since her being at Lambton, she had heard that Miss Darcy was exceedingly proud, but the observation of a very few minutes convinced her that she was only exceedingly shy. She found it difficult to obtain even a word from her beyond a monosyllable. Oh, you shy people. You amuse me so much. You're almost human. Miss Darcy was tall and on a larger scale than Elizabeth, and though little more than 16, her figure was formed, and her appearance womanly and graceful. She was less handsome than her brother, but there was sense and good humor in her face, and her manners were perfectly unassuming and gentle. Elizabeth, who had expected to find in her as acute and unembarrassed an observer as ever Mr. Darcy had been, was much relieved by discerning such different feelings. They had not long been together before Darcy told her that Bingley was also coming to wait on her, and she had barely time to express her satisfaction and prepare for such a visitor when Bingley's quick step was heard on the stairs, and in a moment he entered the room. All Elizabeth's anger against him had been long done away, but had she still felt any, it could hardly have stood its ground against the unaffected cordiality with which he expressed himself on seeing her again. He inquired in a friendly though general way after her family, and looked and spoke with the same good-humored ease that he had ever done. Apart from anything else, apart from, for instance, behind-the-scenes urging from Darcy, I think it's pretty obvious that Elizabeth is just someone that you like knowing. It doesn't really surprise me that if friends of hers from Meryton knew she was in town, they would all flock to see her, in a way that they wouldn't to someone more boring, even if that someone was of the same social register. To Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, he was scarcely a less interesting personage than to herself. They had long wished to see him. The whole party before them, indeed, excited a lively attention. The suspicion which had just arisen of Mr. Darcy and their niece directed their observations towards each with an earnest though guarded enquiry, and they soon drew from those enquiries the full conviction that one of them at least knew what it was to love. Of the lady's sensations they remained little in doubt, but that the gentleman was overflowing with admiration was evident enough. Elizabeth, on her side, had much to do. She wanted to ascertain the feelings of each of her visitors. She wanted to compose her own and to make herself agreeable to all, and in the latter object, where she feared most to fail, she was most sure of success, for those to whom she endeavored to give pleasure were prepossessed in her favor. Bingley was ready, Georgiana was eager, and Darcy determined to be pleased. In seeing Bingley, her thoughts naturally flew to her sister. and oh, how ardently did she long to know whether any of his were directed in like manner. He's asking about her family, but so far he's not asking about anybody in particular. Sometimes she could fancy that he talked less than on former occasions, and once or twice pleased herself with the notion that as he looked at her he was trying to trace a resemblance, trying to see Jane in her face. But though this might be imaginary, she could not be deceived as to his behavior to Miss Darcy, who had been set up as a rival of Jane. Nothing occurred between them that could justify the hopes of his sister. On this point she was soon satisfied, and the 2 or 3 little circumstances occurred ere they parted, which, in her anxious interpretation, denoted a recollection of Jane, not untinctured by tenderness, and a wish of saying more than might lead to the mention of her had he dared. He observed to her at a moment when the others were talking together, and in a tone which had something of real regret, that it, quote, was a very long time since he had had the pleasure of seeing her. And before she could reply, he added, "It is above 8 months. We have not met since the 26th of November, when we were all dancing together at Netherfield." He's counting the days. He knows the exact day. That was the last time he saw Jane. Elizabeth was pleased to find his memory so exact, and he afterwards took occasion to ask her, when unattended by any of the rest, whether all her sisters were at Longbourn. There was not much in the question, nor in the preceding remark, but there was a look and a manner which gave them meaning. It was not often that she could turn her eyes on Mr. Darcy himself, but whenever she did catch a glimpse, she saw an expression of general complacence, and in all that he said she heard an accent so far removed from the hauteur and disdain of his companions as convinced her that the improvement of manners which she had yesterday witnessed, however temporary its existence might prove, had at least outlived one day. So he was very different when they met him at Pemberley, and he's still that way. He's a completely different guy. When she saw him thus seeking the acquaintance and courting the good opinions of people with whom any intercourse a few months ago would have been a disgrace, when she saw him thus civil, not only to herself, but to the very relations whom he openly disdained, and recollected that last lively scene at Hunsford Parsonage, the difference, the change, was so great, and struck so forcefully on her mind, that she could hardly restrain her astonishment from being visible. Never, even in the company of his dear friends at Netherfield, or his dignified relations at Rosings, had she seen him so desirous to please, so free from self-consequence, or unbending reserve as now, when no importance could result from the success of his endeavors. No? You don't think so, Lizzie? Don't think there's anything to be won here? Try looking in the mirror, young lady. And when even the acquaintance of those to whom his attention were addressed would draw down the ridicule and censure of the ladies of both Netherfield and Rosings. Not all the ladies. Their visitors stayed with them above half an hour, and when they arose to depart, Mr. Darcy called on his sister to join him in expressing their wish of seeing Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner and Miss Bennet to dine at Pemberley before they left the country. Miss Darcy, though with a diffidence which marked her little in the habit of giving invitations, no, because she's an introvert, readily obeyed. Mrs. Gardiner looked at her niece, desirous of knowing how she, whom the invitation most concerned, felt disposed as to its acceptance, but Elizabeth had turned away her head. Presuming, however, that this studied avoidance spoke rather of a momentary embarrassment than of any dislike of the proposal, and seeing in her husband, who was fond of society, a perfect willingness to accept it, she ventured to engage for her attendance, and the day after the next was fixed on. Darcy not only wants her to meet his sister, he wants her to eat at Pemberley. Bingley expressed a great pleasure in the certainty of seeing Elizabeth again, having still a great deal to say to her, and many inquiries to make after all their Hertfordshire friends. Elizabeth, construing all this into a wish of hearing her speak of her sister, was pleased, and on this account, as well as on some others, found herself, when their visitors left them, capable of considering the last half hour with some satisfaction, though while it was passing, the enjoyment had been little. She's too nervous to enjoy herself. Eager to be all alone, and fearful of inquiries or hints from her uncle and aunt, she stayed with them only long enough to hear their favourable opinions of Bingley, and then hurried away to dress. But she had no reason to fear Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner's curiosity. It was not their wish to force her communication. It was evident that she was much acquainted with Mr. Darcy than they had before any idea of. It was evident that he was very much in love with her. They saw much of interest, but nothing to justify enquiry. Of course, I love my Mrs. Bennet, but I would not have been able to resist. There, you don't have to be Mrs. Bennet to want to ask a few questions here. Of Mr. Darcy, it was now a matter of anxiety to think well, and as far as their acquaintance reached, there was no fault to find. They could not be untouched by his politeness, and had they drawn his character from their own feelings and his servant's report, without any reference to any other account, i.e. Wickham, the circle in Hertfordshire to which he was known would not have recognized it for Mr. Darcy. There was now an interest, however, in believing the housekeeper, and they soon became sensible that the authority of a servant who had known him since he was 4 years old, and whose own manner indicated respectability, was not to be hastily rejected. Neither had anything occurred in the intelligence of their Lambton friends that could materially lessen its weight. Keep in mind, they know people in the neighborhood. Another damning source, if there were anything damning to hear. They had nothing to accuse him of but pride. Pride he probably had, and if not, it would certainly be imputed by the inhabitants of a small market town where the family did not visit. It was acknowledged, however, that he was a liberal man and did much good among the poor. We've already seen how easy it is for the Darcys to appear proud when they're not. So the small market town where Darcy hardly ever appears could easily think that. With respect to Wickham, the travellers soon found that he was not held there in much estimation. They ask about him as well. For though the chief of his concerns with the son of his patron were imperfectly understood, it was yet well known the fact that, on his quitting Derbyshire, he had left many debts behind him, and Mr. Darcy afterwards discharged them. This just gets better and better. Not only do the local people have nothing good to say about Wickham, but they have bad things to say about him. He left bills behind, and Darcy paid them. How does that square with Wickham's characterization of him? It doesn't at all. As for Elizabeth, her thoughts were at Pemberley this evening more than the last, and the evening, as it passed seemed long, was not long enough to determine her feelings towards one in that mansion. And she lay awake 2 whole hours endeavoring to make them out. She certainly did not hate him. You love him, you idiot. You love him. Oh, God. No, hatred had vanished long ago, and she had almost as long been ashamed of ever feeling a dislike against him that could be so called. The respect created by the conviction of his valuable qualities, though at first unwillingly admitted, had for some time ceased to be repugnant to her feelings. And it was now heightened to somewhat of a friendlier nature by the testimony so highly in his favor, and bringing forward his disposition in so amiable a light, which yesterday had produced. But above all, above respect and esteem, there was a motive within her of goodwill which could not be overlooked. It was gratitude. Gratitude, not merely for having once loved her, but for loving her still well enough to forgive all the petulance and acrimony of her manner in rejecting him, and all the unjust accusations accompanying her rejection. He, who she had been persuaded would avoid her as his greatest enemy, seemed on this accidental meeting most eager to preserve the acquaintance, and without any indelicate display of regard, or any peculiarity of manner, where their two selves only were concerned, was soliciting the good opinion of her friends, and bent on making her known to his sister. Such a change in a man of so much pride excited not only astonishment, but gratitude. For to love, ardent love, it must be attributed, and as such its impressions on her were of a sort to be encouraged, as by no means unpleasing, though it could not be exactly defined. Oh my God. Oh my God. You moron. It can be exactly defined, Lizzie. It's love. You love him. Oh my God. She respected, she esteemed, she was grateful to him. She felt a real interest in his welfare. And she only wanted to know how far she wished that welfare to depend on herself, and how far it would be for the happiness of both that she should employ the power which her family told her she possessed of bringing on a renewal of his addresses. This is written in obviously lawyerly language. I think it is a clear, I don't know for sure, but I think Jane Austen is trying to make her readers yell at the page. I think she's trying to do it by writing it this way. She doesn't have to write like this. It had been settled in the evening between aunt and niece that such a striking civility as Miss Darcy's, in coming to them on the very day of her arrival at Pemberley, for she had reached it only at late breakfast, ought to be imitated, though it could not be equalled, by some exertion of politeness on their side, and consequently that it would be highly expedient to wait on her at Pemberley the following morning. They were, therefore, to go. Elizabeth was pleased, though when she asked herself the reason, she had very little to say in reply. It's a 4-letter word. Mr. Gardner left them soon after breakfast. The fishing scheme had been renewed the day before, and a positive engagement made of his meeting some of the gentlemen of Pemberley by noon. And that is the end of the chapter. Mr. Gardner got an offer from Mr. Darcy to feel free to fish in my streams anytime you want. I'll lend you equipment. I have excellent streams. And Mr. Gardner he's a gentleman. He is perfectly finely mannered, well-spoken, very friendly, very outgoing, but he does love his fishing. So he wants to take Darcy up on the offer. He says in the last chapter, well, you know, these great men, you know how they are. They're all liberal one moment, and then the next moment they forget it, and just as like to order you off their land. But it turns out the offer was sincere, and he wants to take it up. He wants to go fishing. So they're all Pemberley bound. So anyway, that's this chapter. I think, obviously, since I'm beaming like a 4-year-old, I love this stuff. I think this book gets stronger as it goes along, and the Velociraptors are still coming. So, but I hope you're enjoying it. I'm certainly enjoying reading this to you. But I'll wrap this up for now. We'll move on to the next chapter next time. Thank you, BookTube.